I really strongly feel called to seminary.
Wow.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, that's the direction I'm going. In fact, a lot of the teaching through KFX, I've been able to pick up on a lot of people and send away. And I think God has really helped to guide me and listen to people who,
Great.
are in that mode. And John MacArthur and some of the other people that take an approach of really examining and thoroughly
Super.
taking all the information.
Only one quick word of advice. Make sure you know what you believe before you get there.
Right. Well, you know what? That's the one thing. I appreciate your advice on that, because my foundation has been created, and I've been doing a lot of it. Never takes away, understand, from my Bible reading, but it really enhances what I'm doing in terms of illuminating all the facts in and around it.
Jeff, thank you. Want to go to Forrest in Santa Monica, California, listening on KKLA. Forrest, welcome.
God love you, Hank. And James, I'm so glad that you take my call. I'm wanting to know one thing. I'm a King James advocate only because of my big study Bible is the King James. I have the two other. In fact, I also have the New English Bible that I like to read. But the King James, all of my dictionaries and comprehensive other things are geared to it, so I study it. But I find that there's one thing in it that perhaps you can help me understand. The 16th chapter of Mark, the 8th verse on my King James, it's a hotel put out in the 1956, 57, 58. It plainly states that that was not added to that. But that was blank. That's the 8th verse. And what I wanted to know, really what I wanted to ask was, do you have any knowledge or information as to how the King James Version was put together?
Well, in regards to the specific passage you mentioned, there's a couple of pages beginning on page 255 in my book that deals with Mark 16, 9 through 20 and the endings of Mark. And there's a whole lot of information on that particular subject. But when you say how is it put together, the reason the King James contains the passage is because the Greek text from which it was translated contained the passage. And in fact, 99.9% of all Greek manuscripts in the world contain some ending for Mark, the vast majority, the ending that you find in the King James Version of the Bible. And so the translators were simply translating the text that they had in front of them, and that text contained the passage, and so they did so. Now, if you mean, was it translated dynamically or formally? It is primarily a formal translation, but sometimes it surprises you. I give you an example in the book where I believe it's Amos 4:4. The King James and the NIV give the dynamic translation. The NASB and the New King James give the literal formal translation. And so you find the King James and the NIV joining up, and the others provide more formal. So there are places. There's a real good example in Matthew in the crucifixion story. What does the King James say when the thieves are reviling Jesus? It says, they cast the same in his teeth. There is no word cast, there is no word same, there is no word his, and there is no word teeth anywhere in the Greek. The word simply means they reviled him. But the King James translators chose to express that in a more dynamic meaning way of saying they cast the same in his teeth. And so the King James is not free of dynamic translation. The amazing thing is people like Dr. D.A. Waite just attack any type of use of dynamic translation at all as being diabolical and devilish. And yet you find it in the King James itself.
But in the fullness of the King James Version, how was it started out as to become a translation?
Well, the initial idea was placed before King James by John Reynolds in 1604. And the king was rather amenable to the idea because of the fact that the king really detested the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible had notes that undercut his ideas of what a king should be. And so he was amenable to the idea of coming up with a new translation. I think the irony of ironies is a few years later someone took the King James and put the Geneva study notes with it, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful thing of history. But anyways...
James the first did
I think it was great. But that's where the impetus originally came from, was from John Reynolds suggesting it at a famous meeting with the king in 1604.
Well, I'd understood that he had requested 40 of the greatest scribes and most learned men in the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and also in the Greek to be put into There's 40 of them that fit into full bodies of 10, going into different parts of the country and taking the Byzantine and one of the others,
Yes, I know what you're referring. Yeah, I know what you're referring to, and I didn't understand what you were asking. Yes, there were the greatest scholars that England knew, 48 or more. It's hard to know exactly who was involved in everything. That met at Cambridge and other places to work on the translation over that period of time. We don't know a lot about how they did it, specifically their committee meetings and stuff like that. The few notes that were taken in Latin. And in fact, they were actually, most of them were better with Latin than they were with Greek or Hebrew. And in fact, the King James has a number of places that come from the Latin and not from the Greek text itself. Erasmus did the same thing. Acts 8:37 is a good example of that comes from the Latin rather than from the Greek. And their translation was very heavily influenced by the Latin as well. But yes, they were great scholars. It remains today a monument to Bible scholarship. There's no two ways about it. But they themselves would say, if you haven't learned something more after 360 some odd years, you guys are really slow. There's a problem here. They would be right behind us in providing translations.
Forrest, appreciate your call again today. I want to go to Tony in San Jose, California. Tony's listening on KFAX. Welcome to the broadcast.
Hi. The first question I have is Dr. D.A. Waite, is he the one who said that if he went to Russia that he would require the people to first learn English before the gospel?
No, that was Dr. Samuel Gipp in a recent debate that I did was asked if I today lived in Russia and I wanted to have the perfect infallible Word of God, would I have to learn English? And his response was, yes, you would. That is a perspective of the Ruckman-Gipp viewpoint. It is Dr. D.A. Waite would say that you need to use the TR, but as long as you provide a faithful translation in Russian of the TR, then you're providing the Word of God.
But is it your position that you need to, so far you've been, the Johannine comma, okay? Mm-hmm. Most of the evidence for that, the Old Syriac, the Old Latin, the Vulgate, the Italic, most all of those before the 5th century, there's many, many Latin citations of that verse being there, and it's conspicuously absent from the Greek, but why is no attention paid to the Latin? Didn't the Word of God spread out and into the different languages?
Well, but again, you're dealing there with a secondary source, a secondary translation from the original, and the problem with going with the Latin is that there are all sorts of readings that have far more textual basis behind them than the Comma Johanneum has that are rejected by the King James. I mean, we would have to be